welcome to another one in the series of our Russia Resurrected, Russia in the 21st century. We're thrilled. Actually, one of our goals is to have a younger, newer generation of scholars come out as well, who may not be as familiar with Stanford. And so I'm really pleased to introduce to you David Saccone, who has come all the way from beautiful Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, we didn't produce our best Northern California day for you, but it's still probably better than what it is in D.C. Although you had 70 degrees a few days ago, didn't you? Yeah, okay. So welcome, everyone. And David is currently an assistant professor of political science at George Washington University, and he's been there since 2016. He went there after finishing his dissertation and PhD in political science at Columbia University. His dissertation is being turned into a book, which is called Politics for Profit, Business, Elections, and Policy Making in Russia, and it's forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. And I should say that was a prize-winning dissertation that is becoming this book. He won the Robert Tucker Stephen Cohen Dissertation Prize from ASES, which is the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, for outstanding dissertation. And he also was a winner of the American Political Science Association, very prestigious Gabriel Almond Award for the best dissertation in comparative politics. So that is going to be an awesome book, and we all look forward to it coming out. David also has worked on business people in elected office globally, and also has been published in the American Political Science Review, the British Journal of Political Science, World Politics, Journal of Politics and Comparative Political Studies. At Columbia, he worked with Tim Fry, who we will also haul out here, hopefully this year. And so, David, thank you so much for coming. We're thrilled that you're here. I'll move around here.
Okay. Can people hear me? Thank you very much, Catherine, for the very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming to hopefully it will be an engaging lunch talk. I'm not going to talk too long to make sure that there's ample time for questions. The title of the talk today is going to be Russia as a Failed Developmental State. And I'm going to be talking about three main questions. And just in case you have to pop out early, hopefully most of the big takeaways are on this slide. The first question I want to talk about is how can we best understand Russia's economic policy choices? There's been a lot of people working on the idea of social stability, mediocre, stagnant growth, and also declining consumer welfare in Russia over the last 20 years. And people have put forth pretty provocative ideas, something called Putinomics, or the authoritarian model of economic growth. And maybe we should be emulating things that Russia is doing because they seem to have achieved certain desirable outcomes that can be replicated around the world. So one big question I'm going to be talking about today is, what are they doing? And how do we understand it in a comparative context, the type of decisions that people in the Kremlin or other policymakers and ministers over the last decade have implemented in Russia, specifically in response to international sanctions and falling oil prices. And I'm going to put on my comparative politics hat and really try to situate a lot of the economic policy in the developmental state model that was perfected in East Asia, countries like Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong. Talk about how Russia selectively incorporated some of those reforms, and they haven't gone necessarily as expected. So the main second question we're talking about, how do we explain the divergence of Russia from this kind of ideal developmental state model of economic growth, and what kind of consequences should we expect? And the big things that I think I've noticed over the last couple of years of studying these issues is that there's unparalleled elite consensus that people at the higher ranks of the Russian government and economic society really have achieved a kind of agreement about what's best for Russia, and that's quite suboptimal. That's undesirable for a number of reasons that I'm going to go into. And the primary outcome is historic levels of inequality. So just like in this country, we're talking about inequality as a major issue in the upcoming presidential campaign in 2020, I'm going to argue today that we need to think less about maybe the defense of free and fair elections or even certain types of free speech debates in Russia as driving the next kind of wave of discontent. Instead, I think we need to think about inequality and the different manifestations that it can have in Russian society and how the average Russian citizen is going to respond to this growing gap in welfare between the rich and poor, and how this is really going to influence Russian politics going forward. And finally, I'll conclude for maybe some new ideas for U.S. policy towards Russia and how we can take advantage of some of the different trends and evolution of the Russian economic environment and capitalize on them to push for outcomes that are both best for Russia and for the United States. So hopefully there'll be a couple ideas maybe you're not as familiar with about dealing with Russia. So I won't do too much kind of archaic theoretical political science, but just so we're on the same page, what is the developmental state model? Well, people are probably familiar that during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, many countries in East Asia and then in Southeast Asia achieved really incredible levels of economic growth very rapidly. People got pulled out of poverty into the middle class, and countries such as Japan and China became world leaders in technology and other economic sectors and put themselves firmly in the square of developed countries. And since then, scholars have said, okay, what did they do right? What did they share in terms of different policy decisions that they made, and how might other countries learn from their experience? Those lessons kind of got put together in what we might call the developmental state model, and it's been emulated all around the world. A lot of countries in Africa and Latin America have said, we would like to achieve the same type of successes that the East Asian tigers were able to achieve. What can we learn from them? So I want to boil this down to a couple main points, and these are going to drive kind of how we might understand Russian political choices, because there's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of learning from Russia and these East Asian cases as well. And if anything, there's policymakers in Russia who said, we want to be more like Singapore. We want to be more like South Korea. Let's take what they were doing and see if we can implement it in Russia. So first, the main takeaway is, government is going to be firmly entrenched in economic decision-making. They're going to help coordinate activity and investment, solve certain problems, provide government goods. This is not free market capitalism, but it's very focused and informed government intervention to solve some market failures. So the state is at the center of a lot of the key production in the developmental state. And you do that with an elite, insulated, very talented and competent bureaucrat. So government is trying to attract the best and brightest to make good decisions about what kind of sectors do we want to promote, what kind of experts do we want to upgrade to, and so forth. So you have high-performing government that is very involved in the market, but they're working with business. Business has a seat at the table, maybe even 2 or 3 seats at the table. They're coordinating, they're sharing information. Officials are going up to businesses and saying, what's working, what's not, what's the optimal tax rate, what kind of infrastructure do we need? So there's a lot of feedback mechanisms that make that cooperation happen. Some of that cooperation is through kind of pilot agencies. So this is a picture of the Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Investment, MITI. Very famous institution that did a lot of these tasks. So they had these elaborate competitions and went to the best universities, put the brightest minds around one table and said, how do we make Japan grow in the post-World War II environment? And did a lot of very innovative things because they had a lot of authority and responsibility to push for economic policy decisions. And finally, most of these states were somewhat authoritarian. Now, I want to talk about a certain type of authoritarianism, which is, it's not just about centralizing power and a dictator at the top making all decisions. It's the idea that populist and popular pressures from below don't stop reforms. So when you don't allow democracy to really take root, you can say, this is our model, we're going to do it, we're going to have the bureaucrats in charge working with the business people, and voters aren't going to be able to slow it down. So 5 kind of nuts and bolts of what we might think make up one recipe for economic growth that has been implemented in at least a half dozen, if not a dozen countries to varying degrees, but usually high degrees of success since the 1960s. Now, what's interesting is that Russia has sent people to many of these countries to learn about how it can incorporate a lot of these lessons. So here's Putin and Lee Kuan Yew, the Singapore leader for many decades who was praised around the world for leading this charge and kind of disseminating the lessons of this model. Dmitry Medvedev has been on record saying we need to follow Singapore. Putin's gone to China many times, especially in his first 2 administrations, and said, look, there's a lot of things that we could learn from China about their rise. What can Russia do to emulate it? South Korea and Taiwan and Hong Kong also have had some international interaction with Russian ministers, Russian governors to import best practices. So there's exchange. And maybe it's not dominant in the minds of the Kremlin, but they are cognizant that you don't just have to follow the Western European or US model of economic growth. They can look east for some ideas about how to balance some of their competing objectives. So I think this has been a really interesting development since Putin took office. And I want to talk about how selectively they've incorporated some of these tenets. So you might be aware that Russia right now is dominated by very, very, very large state corporations. And these corporations are run sometimes by ex-ministers or very politically connected individuals. And they own a lot of the country's oil and gas. They dominate some of the other kind of mining exploration and exploitation. They are huge players on international markets. Some people think, oh, this is unique, right? Russia's one of the first people to come up with this. Well, not really, actually. China and Taiwan had a very similar model in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. It's called KMT Inc. in Taiwan because the party leaders played very similar roles with big state corporations, and there's a lot of focus on nationalization during this period. I'm not going to argue that Russia went to Taiwan and just picked the exact same strategy, but there's more similarities and differences. This isn't necessarily something unique that Putin has come up with. Countries have done very similar things in the late 20th century in order to try to organize economic growth. State-owned banks who are, dominate a lot of the financing of these champions. Again, not that unique to Russia. It's something that they may have picked up along the way from some of their Asian counterparts. And coordination with business groups. I'll give the example of Tatarstan, which I think is kind of unrecognized as the leading star right now in Russia. Tatarstan is a Muslim-majority region in central Russia. Not really on the radar of a lot of kind of people, Russia watchers, who are thinking about what are the sources of Russia growth going forward. But this is a dynamic region that's grown at least twice or 3 times the national average over the last 2 decades. There are innovative clusters, such as Innopolis, which is right outside the capital city of Kazan. They've got about 100 companies that are working on various types of technological innovation, both Russian and multinational. And very often, the Kremlin is going to Tatarstan to say, what can we learn about organizing cooperation with business? The way that there's councils and legislative institutions where you get cooperation on a lot of different aspects. And there's been really remarkable results for this somewhat small part of the Russian economy that has a lot of similarities with exactly that East Asian developmental state and has been, like I said, praised as the next wave or the next step of Russian economic development. Next, we have the idea of import substitution and protectionism. People have probably seen the pictures of Russian bulldozers destroying agricultural products since the international sanctions were introduced in 2014. Russia's adopted a quite antagonistic relationship with the West and said, we want to protect our domestic industry from competitors abroad so we can grow it in a nice shielded environment, and then those companies can go onto international markets and export a lot of those products. So what we've seen in the last 10 years, very similar to what the South Koreans did, is you implement import substitution policies in areas such as agriculture and food products, medicines, software, to give Russian companies a fighting chance and targeting a lot of subsidies so maybe they can get on their feet quicker. There is varying degrees of success for this type of approach, but there is evidence that other countries that have taken different steps, and the United States is actually one example in the 19th century, where we said, our companies are never going to become large international actors if they have to compete immediately on international markets. Let's give them some breathing room and some cash so they can get big enough and don't get squashed on world markets. And Russia's been really trying to do the same, partly because it's been blocked from international markets, but also because these are strategic choices by the Kremlin to say, let's walk away from some kind of like globalization or internationalization, and hopefully our country will get on its feet a little bit sooner. And finally, the idea of improving bureaucracy. Now, I think this slide will probably be the most surprising to people, that there's a lot of innovation within the Russian government that is kind of taken for granted. A lot of people think, oh gosh, every single bureaucrat must be corrupt as the next one. They all have real estate and apartments in Miami and New York. They're stealing wherever they can from the Russian government, and it's a kind of miracle that the government hasn't collapsed. I think that's pretty far from the truth. And if anything, the Russian government is extremely diverse. There are some of the best and smartest people working in certain ministries across the street from people trying to steal wherever they can. I'm going to talk about the schizophrenia in a couple slides, but the idea here is that the Russian government actually has a lot of strengths and weaknesses, and they've done some pretty exciting things in the last 10 years to upgrade. Now, I'm not saying everything has been successful, but they're doing things that I think other countries could learn from. So there are some empowered government bodies that have a lot of autonomy and independence that have aggregated a lot of knowledge and are doing great things. I'll highlight kind of the accounts chamber, which is now run by Alexei Kudrin, a lot of think tankers and professors and academics trying to think about what does Russia look like in 2030 or 2040, and where are the sources of economic growth? Huge emphasis on digitalization. My work on Russia is really motivated by all this open data that's out there, and there's more data on Russia than there is on the United States comparably on many, many, many different dimensions. So by making things more transparent, it's trying to make it more efficient and reduce opportunities for corruption. One thing I really like are these multifunctional centers. If anybody's been to Russia in the last 5 or 10 years, it's easier to get a driver's license or have really any interactions with the state in Russia than it is in the United States. I know that sounds kind of heretical or blasphemous, but there's a lot of services that have been dramatically reformed since 2010, and we could learn a little bit about how to improve the efficiency of certain things. Again, I'm not making a blanket statement that all is well and good within the Russian government, but it's not like they're staying on their back heels waiting for oil and gas and just people to steal and put it in the West. 2 big examples. 1, leaders of Russia. Every year, about 50,000 people compete for the chance to win high-level positions in the Russian government, kind of like an American Idol competition, where they're going to interviews and doing mock business cases, making presentations with a select group of corporate and government elites that are deciding who the top 50 or 100 people are every year and putting them in deputy ministry positions all over the government. There's a lot of demand for these type of competitions to meritocratically select the next generation of Russian leaders. So it's promising. This is not something that was done in the first 5 or 10 years of Putin's administration. It's definitely not something that was done in the 1990s, where informal connections really decided where you'd work in the government. The second kind of overlaps with some of my work, which are income and asset disclosures. On paper, Russia has really good anti-corruption reforms. That doesn't mean that they're implemented, but one of them is that Russia actually has the best system for enforcing transparency among individual officials. So over 1 million government officials have to declare all of their real estate, all of their income, all of their cars for themselves, their spouses, and their children every single year for the last 10 years. We're working to standardize this at this website, declarado.org, but the government is collecting all this information and making a lot of it public so that you can hold officials accountable. This is more information than we can get from the US government. It's easier to figure out how much wealth on paper Russian officials have than it is to get the comparable officials from the Trump administration. So there are some administrative reforms where they're not just being completely complacent about some of these issues, and it's our job to figure out what's working and what's not. Here we go. So what is working and what's not? Well, how has the country diverged from this ideal type, and why aren't things as rosy as a lot of the kind of de facto reforms that have, or de jure reforms that have been implemented? I'm going to argue that this selective adaptation of the model has produced something that I don't think people expected when it all started to get underway, which is there is an kind of unprecedented, unparalleled consensus at the top of the business and economic elite about the next steps for Russia's economic growth. We talk a lot about this country about dividing the oligarchs or the oligarchs from Putin, shaving off different centers of influence to get more opposition within the Russian government. Even, and maybe especially because of sanctions, we are seeing more agreement and more consensus 2014 than I think people anticipated. This has led to more political stability, and the country hasn't collapsed necessarily under a lot of the economic pressure, but it's had these other externalities and unintended consequences that are important for thinking about the next couple of years. Which is first, that because you have the top echelon working so closely with one another, sharing in a lot of the kind of rents that are being produced, especially from natural resources, but a lot of the other kind of government programs, income gains are disproportionately accruing to the wealthy at a rate where only the US and China compare. So in this country, we talk about the 1% doing dramatically better than the rest of the country. Russia, the only country that's actually comparable is Russia, and China is somewhat farther behind, but not that much. Second, in this country, we talk about breaking up big tech, and we have Amazon's gotten too big, and there's too much market concentration. Again, a lot of similarities with the Russian model. When you have regulators and business in each other's pockets, you're not going to get the type of anti-monopoly interventions that allow for competition and allow for more equal gains being spread out within society. So again, a lot of this is upward redistribution. The wealthy are getting wealthier, and the poor are getting poor, and that gap is widening, and with a lot of parallels with what's going on in American society. There are things you can do to fix that. In this country, we talk about more redistribution, whether it's free education or subsidized healthcare. Russia's pushed pause on a lot of the reforms and actually retrenched a lot of its redistribution commitments, whether it's turning back some of the pension reform, cutting back on social spending or inefficient social spending. So usually when you have this type of wealth accumulation, you want to check it a bit and make sure that the people on the bottom of the ladder are getting some of that money. And if anything, we're getting the exact opposite tendency in Russia. And all of this inequality is creating kind of new abuses of power. So the idea that there's a rule of law for the wealthy and a rule of law for the impoverished. And if you have connections, you can basically act unchecked and unrestrained and get yourself out of a lot of tricky situations where people with less privilege and less money find themselves at the whims of a really arbitrary judicial system. It's one symptom of this idea that as wealth gap gets bigger, so do kind of political and social rights go with it. And these are the things where we're going to start to see more and more discontent, that inequality creates a ton of other problems within society, and that they're going to manifest themselves in, I think, quite interesting ways going forward, just like they are right now in the type of debates we're having about the next 4 years of American policy. Now, how did this happen? Well, I presented to you a very idealized version of the developmental state, this kind of benevolent government that steps in, fixed markets, and bureaucrats who are super talented and make all the right decisions. Well, actually, that's not what really happened in a lot of these East Asian countries. If anything, they had a lot of corruption during most of that time. But what happened was that corruption sometimes actually promoted growth and helped public goods be distributed. And I know this might sound counterintuitive, but if you have a lot of competition and balance between the government and the private sector, sometimes they can cooperate, and as a byproduct, the rest of society benefits. So for example, in South Korea, a lot of companies competing for influence, money going back and forth between the public and the private sector, but in doing so, there was coordination where that people were getting their side payments, but Korean society was benefiting because the right companies were competing for the right types of subsidies and the right type of privileges. So although we think that corruption is antithetical to economic growth, in the East Asian model, if you have balance between the government and the private sector, sometimes competition can actually produce pretty positive and unexpected outcomes. What's wrong with Russia right now is the bureaucracy is not working as it should and not checking a lot of the business influence. And especially right now, you just have a group of economic and political elites that are not competing for influence. You have a number of really, really large monopolistic players and a number of very greedy bureaucrats that are working in very much divergence from this optimal developmental state model. So why is that? First is that nepotism and informal connections are really dominating a lot of this selection into the bureaucracy. What we're seeing right now is instead of this idealized kind of meritocratic technocrats running the Russian government, you have the sons, daughters, cousins, grandsons, and granddaughters of the previous Russian elite rising to really, really, really high levels in the Russian government and the economic elite. So you're not getting competition between the government and the private sector. You're getting overlapping networks where everybody's patting each other on the back and nobody's actually working at odds or balancing each other. This bureaucracy is way too big. We talk a lot about redistribution in the forms of welfare commitments or pensions, free healthcare. In Russia, that's not quite how it works. The state provides about 50% of income or employment in a lot of regions around the country. So that the bureaucracy is way bigger than it should be, which makes it kind of chaotic, makes it cumbersome, slow to react to problems. So you've got an enlarged bureaucracy full of a lot of people that aren't there for the right reasons, be because they had a familial connection or they paid for their job. And this is especially happening at lower levels of government. So this ideal of creating an elite insulated bureaucracy has fallen quite short. And because of that, you're getting a lot of greedy officials that are not working against business and regulating it properly. They're giving into business and taking a cut of the action. Next, we're not getting that kind of focused corruption that sometimes can produce optimal political and economic outcomes. So I'll make this one real big point. In a lot of the East Asian cases, they closed their societies to capital exit. So you could make money from the government, but that money had to stay in South Korea or in China or in Taiwan and Hong Kong. What's happened is that Russia opened up its capital accounts. It liberalized so that Russian money was able to leave the country. Now, we are also complicit as the West because we welcomed it and we just looked the other way. people across the financial and the real estate industry and in the United States government just didn't think this was a problem or specifically ignored the idea of Russian capital leaving. So what that allowed this to do is instead of the corruption working to the benefit of society because it was being invested back in the state, and then a lot of these actors were thinking about what their next step was, how to make money off of the corruption that they already orchestrated, they were just taking it and putting in the US, the UK, and Switzerland, and it wasn't going to the benefit of Russian society. So this is something the West needs to take responsibility for, but also the Russian model allowed the capital to leave, and it will probably never come back to Russia. All these attempts to re-domesticate all this capital are falling short. So instead of getting focused corruption that's going to be directed towards more and more investment, when greedy bureaucrats still want to make 5% on the money that they took from government, they're putting it in bank accounts and real estate abroad instead of reinvesting in the Russian economy. So this was a policy choice, but the West has facilitated this, and we need to fix this immediately. I mean, we're already about 15 years too late. I'll talk a little bit more, maybe in the Q&A, about how, in many of the East Asian countries, the corruption was happening among kind of economic or regulators or different type of bureaucrats, where in Russia, the security agencies are playing way too big of a role in terms of undermining property rights and predating a lot of the economic activity that's going on. Okay, back on track. The final thing is that small business has been almost completely sidelined and oppressed in the Russian model. A big takeaway from the East Asian experience is that you can't just focus at the very top. You have to build value chains, medium-sized producers, small tradesmen, entrepreneurs. In Russia, the idea is that everybody at the top is working in concert with each other and making a lot of money, so they don't care about how far that money goes down within the production chain. And if anything, they're harassing and aggravating a lot of the lower levels of business development at rates that we thought would go away at this stage of development of Russia. So here's a quick, kind of for the non-Russian speakers in the room, this is a graph of economic crimes. Over 100,000 business people every single year come under criminal scrutiny for various concocted misdemeanors and felonies related to their business activity. There have been promises to improve the business environment, but nothing has really taken root. So instead of the government kind of acknowledging that small and medium-sized businesses have to be a part of any type of growth prospects, they've allowed the lower level bureaucrats to go after them with impunity, and then the top level bureaucrats give big business a free ride and often benefit to that account. So why do we care? We had this divergence from an East Asian model. So what? The country's pretty stable. It has 1% growth rate. Things don't seem to be really falling apart. Now, I am not the person who says that this is Putin's last year. I mean, I do not think that's the case, but I think there's some kind of informative trends over the last couple of years that are going to play a much bigger role. The first is clearly inequality. I talked about how Russia's peers right now are the US and China. We don't have great statistics on this. So right now, I mean, in the early 2010s, using the most sophisticated methodology, about 70% of the country's wealth was in the hands of 10% of the population. Now, there are estimates that almost 90% are in that wealth is in that same group. This inequality has gone up dramatically even since privatization of the 1990s, and billionaires are putting on $2, $3, $4 billion of profits every single year, even under sanctions, while real incomes have fallen. So the same type of capital accumulation among a very small elite that's happening in this country is very, very evident in Russia, and it still is the world leader in inequality by just about any metric that you take into consideration. Now, what that really comes to the fore is that there's geographic inequality too, and this is where a lot of the problems the Russian government is going to face are going to come from. These blue lines and the orange one are oil-producing regions. You might not know, but a very small fraction of Russia's population and geography has oil within its proximate geography or location. It's concentrated in about 5 to 8 regions that are the big players on the international markets. Those regions have grown exponentially greater than the rest of the country. So here's just real income since the mid-1990s. Moscow and oil regions have done extremely well, and the rest of the country has seen very little improvement, and if anything, slower than the rate of inflation. So you're seeing a divide in the country between the haves and the have-nots, and it's going to be concentrated on rural, sometimes very isolated, I wouldn't want to say the word backward, but underdeveloped regions without a lot of economic prospects, without natural resources, where the elite of those regions have been able to predate on the government, and the people keep falling more and more behind. And I think one of the biggest things to think about is, like in this country, people are worried that their children's outcomes are not better than their own. And there was a lot of hope during the early Putin period that there would be progress, that my child would be able to achieve more income and better opportunities to integrate with the West and a stronger, more secure family life. In Russia, there's more insecurity that actually can be a reality, and that people might think that there's going to be regression. That sense of the opportunities are accruing to a very small few, the judicial system and a lot of the political system is tilted on behalf of that elite, and that the income gap is widening, not just across the entire country, but geographically, are going to be the big hotspots going forward. And I think that's underappreciated when we look at just the 1% stagnation of the Russian economy. There's some people that are growing really well, but the rest of the country is actually doing much, much more poorly than some of the aggregate statistics suggest. So what does this mean for the US approach? First off, we've kind of given up on the idea that there are good apples and bad apples in the Russian government. We've kind of thrown out the baby with the bathwater. And I think that's a strategic mistake. Because as somebody who lives in Russia at least 2 months a year and for the last 10 years and has dealt with some of my best students at Russian universities going to the government, I am very confident that there are Western-oriented and educated people making key decisions in many posts across the country. If we write off the entire Russian government as corrupt officials, we're missing a lot of the talent and competence that's there, as well as openness to ideas and new types of interaction. So I'm not saying we want to engage necessarily with open arms with the Russian government, but the type of exchanges and interaction that we had potentially in the late 2000s, but also going back to the 1990s, have all but stopped because we're so wary of anything to do with the Russian government. We're not spending enough time figuring out who are the right people to be talking to and whether or not that type of exchange and engagement can lead to better results. And I would encourage us to think more creatively and not just write off the entire Russian government as unworkable, unfixable, irredeemable. Second, similarly, we need to embrace the diversity of the Russian business world. The small and medium-sized businesses are the ones that are suffering most under the government and potentially could benefit the most from access to international capital where appropriate, access to international arbitration courts and measures to help protect their property rights, trade and export opportunities. There are partnerships that US businesses can look for outside of the national champions that have conquered a lot of the leading heights of the Russian economy and build those type of partnerships because there's discontent with the way that the Russian government is operating and a lot more openness to growing their businesses on a stronger apolitical footing. And I think, again, we're so hesitant to do anything related to Russia that we're missing some opportunities that are quite unique with constituencies that are going to be more open to the West than the top of the Russian government and economic elite has professed. Third, we need to immediately, like I said, accept responsibility for our role facilitating Russian capital abroad. Not only do we need to do a lot of in-house cleaning and fix our institutions, we need to make sure that that money is sent back to Russia as soon as possible. I'm not saying expropriate it, but it would be a positive step forward if a lot of the money sitting in bank accounts or in real estate or luxury goods was forced to repatriate and people were thinking about the long-term future of Russia. And that's our responsibility, to get that money out of the United States and out of the UK and out of the West and see what happens. Because it's not doing anything good for our country. It's causing inflation in certain markets and distortions. And potentially it could be used to affect positive change in the Russian economic environment. And that's something we can do as US policymakers. And then this fourth thing is developing engagement strategies to highlight the differences between Russia and the West, but also within Russia. The biggest thing right now is kind of an informational bubble about people might not understand just how far they're lagging behind world standards and how their immediate neighbors in Asia or in the Middle East are making more progress on a lot of fundamental indicators than Russia. So our engagement should be less about potentially imposing or enforcing electoral integrity and making the Russia exactly more democratic than the West. We've seen that that doesn't work, and there's a lot of resistance to it. But there are new types of informational strategies where we can highlight economic differences between the countries. This worked very well in the late Cold War period to show that the Russian citizens is that they're not getting the same type of economic opportunities that more competent leadership at the top would provide for them. And that there are different ways of constructing relations that would break this kind of stranglehold that this consensus has imposed over the last 10 or 20 years, and that there's more emulation, there's more integration with the West that's possible because we're open to certain types of cooperation. And I'm not advocating for reducing the sanctions or kind of upending U.S. policy, but I think we need to be more strategic and not just trying to close the door on Russia, because there's a lot of people inside that I think would be more open than we're giving them credit to. So that might be a provocative stance, especially because there's so much antipathy to Russia right now. So I'm happy to take all of your accusatory and critical questions going forward and defend everything I just said. So looking forward to it.
You're in California.
They'll be nice.
Yeah, not going to happen. Okay, great. Thanks. That was actually very helpful. And I have lots of questions, but I can already see David. And so we'll move out to the crowd, and I will add a few things here and there. One thing to note is Tatarstan sends a huge delegation actually here every year over to Stanford Business School right there. And they are talked at for several days by business school professors, and they go to Silicon Valley. And yeah, so some of the innovation, there's always a Stanford role. All right, when you ask your question, and let's make them questions, not speeches or statements, can you please introduce yourself to David so he knows who you are? Yep, David Holloway first.
I'm David Holloway here at CSAC. Thank you very much. I enjoyed your talk a lot. The question I have is not, in fact, a critical one at all. It's just to ask you about something you mentioned briefly, but then didn't talk about, namely the role of the security agencies, because that does seem to have been expanding. As I understand it, they're a major factor in the kind of suppression of small businesses. Well, you gave the statistics on that. Perhaps the political elite is looking more and more to them to deal with the indications of protest or unhappiness with the growing inequality and so on. So I'm wondering how you see them playing into the kind of future in Russia. Are there any chances that their role will be circumscribed? Or is it, that's the question.
Great, that's a fantastic question. When I've done thinking about this, the best kind of corollary to it is a very decentralized Revolutionary Guard emerging in Russia. So we think about the Revolutionary Guard in Iran as a coordinated security agency that's got its tentacles in so many different parts of the economy and is responsible for a disproportionate amount of economic production. In Russia, I think what's been unacknowledged is that security agencies are playing a smaller but marked role in business all across the country, but they're not being coordinated from the top. It's more of a, we'll let them go and we won't check them unless they get too big, and as long as they pay duty or tribute up to the top, this is something which we will accept. I think that trend is going to increase going further, and there's been very little kind of emphasis placed in Moscow about curbing local level security agencies from taking out bigger and bigger business stakes. So they've had fewer opportunities to go abroad. There's less kind of the arbitration opportunities in the 1990s. So if they're going to make money and supplement their salaries, they're going to go after small businesses. And right now the government has tried to create different poles of influence. So for creating competition between the Ministry of Justice and the FSB, and saying if we have competition between two different security agencies, maybe the outcomes will be better and everybody will steal less. And we've seen the outcomes of some of that conflict with people getting arrested and sometimes prosecuted with this interagency conflict. And I am not a criminologist to go in and say, okay, this is exactly the plan and this is what's going to happen. But unless there is another agency that's going to put a check on the FSB, and it's unclear what that would be, I cannot see the security agencies losing influence going forward. And if anything, when you go to a certain region, they're going to be the first gatekeeper if you're going to start a business and get above a certain point. And it's hard to get data on this stuff. It's really, really sensitive as a Westerner to do work on security agencies. So it's contributed to this paucity of information about what's actually going on. And all we can do is speculate about the level of it. And I think that's as harmful. If we don't know how big it is, it's hard to think about how it could actually be reduced.
It's not very systematic either, I think. Yeah, yes.
Could I follow up on that?
Can you just tell David who you are? And
Dave Elliott, affiliate at CSAC. There was a longish article in the paper just today, and they were talking about what used to be called the GRU. I didn't know it had changed its name, but apparently it has a new acronym now. And my reading was that GRU, in terms of personnel, is considerably bigger than FSB. And yet, you do not hear them playing the role in the domestic picture. Maybe they're just clever in keeping it quiet, but if they're big and they're doing it, you'd think it would become known. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, with reservations, I think. The GRU is clearly military intelligence that's going to be focused more on international issues. So their presence theoretically is going to be smaller on the domestic market. There's a lot of exciting research being done to figure out how entrenched they are using kind of new data that's come online about people that have been shareholders and connecting with shell companies to figure out how entrenched the GRU is in Russia. What we've seen is bodies like the GRU or other ones have been much more active abroad, either providing military services, hacking, different types of intelligence operations to take advantage of whether it be Western or developing countries and making money from those exploits. Now, where that money goes and how it filters back in the Russian economy, I don't want to take too many risks in telling you I know exactly. I mean, that would be more than I actually could do. But that kind of division between domestic and international might be helpful for thinking about why you don't hear the GRU pop up as much of the FSB when we're talking about small and medium-sized businesses in Irkutsk or Novosibirsk. The GRU is just going to have a smaller footprint, and they're going to be oriented to different issues.
And they're also pretty firmly still under civilian control, right? So they're not doing business on their own. That's right.
Not openly, no.
Right, not openly. Sure, fair enough. Yep.
I'm Ron Jensen, just an alumnus, and two questions to the other speakers that come through on the basic subject of Russia. And one of them, I'm pretty sure, spoke about the very, very high percentage of young, educated Russians who wanted to leave, and not with the idea that they were going to go to Europe or the US for a year or 2 or 10 and then come back, but wanted to get out and not come back.
It's that survey
And
that
your
Leonid Cosma.
teaching over there, I wonder if you could speak on that. The second thing, in a lot of, maybe I misinterpreted, but a lot of your comments were about, here's what should be done to help Russia, and we have a responsibility to get that money back, to help them. And I just specifically, why would we want to do that?
Sure, I'll start.
Considering that Putin is going to be there for a long time, and I don't, whether you think he's a friend or not is definitely debatable.
So just to intervene, he's referring to a Levada survey from, I think, the end of November, that 53% of Russians ages 18 to 24 are saying they want to leave Russia either part-time or permanently. So, and it was Leonid Gosman who had brought this up, but several others have as well.
For sure, I'll take the second one. I don't think the money should be designed to help Russia. I want to really clarify that. I don't think we should be giving this money to the Russian government. And the Department of Justice, when we talk about asset seizures, has a sophisticated institutional setup. When we find Russian money in this country that is unexplained, we take it and expropriate it, and we will not give it back to the government unless we're confident that that will find its way back to the people. So sometimes there have been cases of certain African countries that have been able to get some of the money back from asset seizures, but the United States is very hesitant to allow when we take something, we don't just hand it back to the Russian government. What I want to maybe emphasize is when we close our doors to illicit or suspicious money from Russia, it forces it to stay in Russia. So it's not going to necessarily help the Russian government, but it's going to force those kind of corrupt bureaucrats from thinking about their own institutional setup and where they might get a return on investment and what kind of policy changes need to be made instead of having kind of a safe haven in the US which it is right now. And I'd rather that money be back in Russia. It's not going to necessarily be in the hands of the government, but then have it sit in kind of tax havens or wherever it is, shell companies, where it can have much more malign influence. It can fund a lot of things. There's suspicion that Russian money is providing key infrastructure to the US government because we don't know, we can't trace ownership. So we need to get it out, but I'm not saying we should hand it back on a civil fight to the Russian government, and that's thankfully not what the Department of Justice or the World Bank advocates. The first one, I first want to put a caveat, and I don't know the study as well as I'm sure the speaker did, but there's a difference between kind of stated preferences and revealed preferences. So a lot of people might want to leave, but the actual exit is much lower. So in Russia, there's been a quite large amount of people that would want to leave over the last 10 or 15 years, but emigration has increased, but it's not necessarily 1 out of every 2 young person is leaving. So one, is really difficult to leave for a lot of people, especially if you're outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, if you don't have a degree from an educational institution that is recognized or encouraged by like a big tech firm that would give you a visa. And the other thing is that the government has channels with and connections with a lot of talented people that never want to work in the private sector. So I think a lot of the 18 to 24-year-olds that really want to leave have even entrepreneurial sense to them. They have skills that are not in demand by government or public office or public sector. Other surveys suggest that among people that want to stay in Russia, their preference is to work for the government because it's a stable source of income. There's really good benefits. There's good social networks. There's good opportunities for advancement. It kind of depends on what degree you got from government, really or from your university, really predicts what your labor market outcomes might be, whether or not you want to stay or whether or not you want to leave abroad and look for that Google job in Ireland and start a new family there, which I agree a lot of people are doing, but there's not a huge sucking sound where a lot of the tech firms are going to Russia and putting people on planes because they have a lot of people to choose from. And there's a lot of other countries that have similar talent to Russia so far.
So there's also, you're probably referring to the Erefeev talk, which was about the Putin Exodus, it's the Atlantic Council. It's on their website if you want to see it. I mean, the out-migration is not as big as the in-migration, but it's a different kind of immigrant coming in as opposed to potentially going out. So one could raise the sort of potentially brain drain issue, which could be underestimated right now. Okay, anyway, I know there are other people who want to ask questions. McFall, I know you have to go.
Yeah, Michael Paul, Stanford. Thanks for a great talk. I came in late, so if you already covered this first question, I apologize, and I'll just go back to the slide. So I have one analytic question and one policy question. The analytic question is there variation in governance, effectiveness, more transparency or not, whatever way you want to describe it? And if so, what explains it within the region? I can think of various hypotheses, but I'd be interested in what you found. And then second, on the policy questions on this list here, I want you to dig in and help operationalize what this looks like in real life. E3 is really easy. 1, 2, and 4, I'm thinking as a former, I used to work in the government for a while, like what does that mean, the first one? Does that mean the U.S. ambassador goes and meets with your former students, or what is that? Number 2, why would anybody trying to make money in Russia want to have any interaction with the U.S. government as small and medium-sized businesses? And then 4, like that sounds pretty, is that just more money to American publications? Is it Russian publications? So help us, very practically, because they all sound very good as goals, but how would you actually develop a strategy to do 1, 2, and 4?
Sure. I'll do the analytical one first. We don't have a great sense because we don't have a lot of cases about regions. And my work right now is more on ministries and agencies. We're seeing, for example, really huge differentials in corruption between certain Moscow-based agencies and other ones in the stealing that's going on. A couple of the hypotheses we're looking at is what kind of networks these people are coming from, so the selection in. Are they taking friends and family and from similar kind of locational backgrounds? I hate to use the word clan, but that's one hypothesis of different groups that are rising up together. There's not a lot of rotation in and out, and therefore there's no monitoring of other people. Whereas agencies that are able to select from a wider group of people and recruit in, people tend to be on their toes in terms of making kind of egregious corrupt acts. Within the regions, it's a lot about how you organize business and government cooperation. The best performing regions, whether it be Kaluga or Tatarstan or even Leningradskaya Oblast, which has attracted a lot of foreign investment, were not even just open to multinationals, but they were able to get a lot of the major business actors around one table, usually in the state legislature, and then hammer out compromise and agreement about what was best for the region going forward, rather than allow a couple of the major players to do it, tell the governor or tell what the key deputy ministers what they needed to do. And that's going to create a lot of losers workers that are going to think about either not investing or moving their business elsewhere. So the Tatarstan model, I think, is one of cooperation and coordination, and it's unique for a lot of kind of historical reasons because of that region and its ethnic population and the clan relations that have kind of emerged there. But it's that sense of they cannot be as antagonistic as they are, and you kind of cooperate the business around certain institutions. Your second one, of course, this could just be pie in the sky. So let me take a huge leap forward, and see what if I was a U.S. policymaker. So the first one, recognized diversity. I think it's exactly the type of exchanges that Catherine was noting, that there are policymakers that are, for example, coming to Stanford, and there are a lot of kind of development professionals working in the Agency for Strategic Initiatives, the accounts chambers, who are tasked with improving their country's business environment. And maybe that doesn't necessarily mean the United States, but there's other developmental agencies in, for example, Germany and the UK that are as kind of less wary and maybe more open to sending some of their production analysts, their value chain improvement guys, and talking to them just about the nuts and bolts of improving the investment climate. So I think that would be a big focus in saying, a lot of the kind of exchange councils that I'm sure you were a part of in the late 2000s were about specific substantive issues and not necessarily about like kind of just lecturing about human rights and democracy. And I think Russians would be more interested in getting that know-how, especially because there's been so much isolation in the last couple of years. The second one, strengthening ties with small and medium businesses. There's an argument, and I think Stan Marcus has made this quite well, that alliances with international organizations, with the media, and with kind of nonpartisan actors can help small and medium-sized businesses defend their property rights in the Russian regions. And the question is, how do you facilitate alliance building? One idea that's been floated is that there's pretty good arbitration court systems in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in the UK that are right now only open to oligarchs. They're really costly. The lawyers are super expensive. We might want to think differently about creating international arbitration mechanisms that are more open to the next class of businesses, not just in Russia, but in China and other places where they're having trouble in the Russian court system in the last 5 years because the arbitration courts have gotten worse. And they're saying, here's a choice of venue. Right now, I'm just stuck in Russia. Is there anything I can look for abroad to sign contracts in order to defend my property rights? And that is going to be a huge international investment, and that's another institution, and when appetites for cooperation are quite low. But I think we need to see if we can reduce or increase the opportunities for smaller businesses to access some of the best property rights protection we have on the international level. And the fourth one, engagement strategies. Yes, this is a tough one because anything you do with inequality is going to be kind of just a spike in the government side. They're very sensitive to a lot of these issues. One idea would be, I mean, more exchanges and trying to increase informedness. Publications is maybe the wrong word, but the Stanford US or the US Stanford Russia Forum and programs like that, seeing how much the government will allow their citizens to travel abroad and to meet counterparts and learn at like a person-to-person type of level, which I think has really unfortunately deteriorated since 2014. I don't know if we've tested the waters and seen if there's more openness to that type of thing. And from a media strategy, I wish I was a better public relations professional, but I think our perception in Russia is we go in and we sometimes talk to them about how their political system should work better. And I think that's very effective, but it's also all about how their economic system is different. And I'll give you an example. The best work right now on propaganda on Russia right now says that people are very reticent, people believe political propaganda more than they believe economic propaganda, that there is an openness to information about politics, but they are benchmarking continuously their experience in the economy against what they're seeing on state television. And they're not believing necessarily what Channel 1 is telling them, that things are great, inflation is low, prices have not gone up, they have all these jobs. They're starting to be more skeptical about government sources of information when it comes to the economy. Now, how do we develop alternate sources of information about the economy that people could gravitate to and says, finally, there's a group of journalists that is not sugarcoating what's going on in this country. I'm okay believing the state television about the politics. I don't know, I can't differentiate what's right and what's wrong, but this is good. There's RBC or Kommersant, and they're expanding their footprint, and they're actually describing events as they unfold and not trying to kind of obfuscate or change my perceptions of something that I can relate really easily. Now, that's a type of kind of economic public relations that I probably need to get another master's degree in order to really kind of articulate what that would look like. But it's kind of changing the way that, changing the issues we emphasize with the average Russian citizen. That was a really long-winded answer, but I had 5 questions, so I kind of took some liberties.
Okay. Yes, can you introduce yourself?
I'm Barbara Dursch from the Hamilton University in Hamburg, and I'd like to come back to your capital account liberalization because I perfectly understand that in the short run it might add to inequality and it might pose problems on the receiving end. But on the other hand, isn't there a flip side in the sense that it introduces an element of competition which you don't have when you keep the money inside of the country? Because this doesn't ensure that it is available for efficient investment and so on and so forth.
I agree. I think one issue with Russia's capital account liberalization is that they've been so restrictive on multinational investment in the last 15 years. So the flows that have come in have really been in portfolio investments in the Russian stock exchange and not in other parts of the Russian economy that we would see in places like South Korea, for example, that allowed international financial flows to go directly to private businesses, and then those private businesses were accountable to a different set of metrics. If anything, the Russian financial system and the actual lending system has been really closed and centered on state-owned banks since 2008, at the same time as the whole economy has been open to money moving out and in portfolio investments and out in transfers to all types of companies. So I think there's a regulation in terms of we want to welcome money that is explainable, that it is coming from clear sources of profit and efficiency, but the laundromats that have appeared as a consequence of really open capital accounts in the last 15 years are not adding value either in the West, and they're subtracting a lot of money in Russia, which even if that money was just going to sit in Mercedes and a lot of the other luxury goods in Russia, it's better spent in Russia than making its way into kind of unprotected or unknown international markets and then into companies that are playing bigger roles in our economy. So this idea that we are facilitating money laundering is the kind of the dark underbelly of the capital account liberalization. And I think we'll probably just have to disagree about where that money should go. Like, when somebody steals $1 million from the government, where should that money land? I tend to fall on the side as it should stay in the country that it was stolen from. But you might make an argument that that money abroad is going to lead to more efficiency. Unfortunately, it's such a hard thing to study. I don't know if we're going to ever agree in the macroeconomics of the best thing. But I think I'm part of just keep the money where it came from, and maybe other things will happen rather than just welcome it. So.
Okay, thanks. Yes.
I'm Yasmin. I'm a junior studying history at Stanford. I was interested to learn that Russia really took inspiration from the Chinese economic model, and it seems that also happened under Gorbachev and seeing China's transition to state capitalism under Deng. I was wondering why, if that sort of has changed your own understanding of the end of the Cold War narrative, with Russia looking to state capitalism as a model rather to American capitalism. And also why, I mean, a lot of American policymakers are looking back at this end of Cold War moment and thinking, how did we get China so wrong? We thought it was economically liberalizing. It seems interesting that almost the Soviets got it so right, that they sort of understood that China was sort of moving towards a hybrid political economic system. So yeah, does that kind of complicate how we understand this end of Cold War moment?
It's interesting. I usually think of it's a great question, the end of the Cold War going in the opposite way, that the Chinese were learning from the Soviets more than the Soviets were learning from the Chinese. And one of the big problems of the Soviets didn't study, they maybe because sequentially the Chinese reforms happened a little bit later, but I think the Chinese saw what was going on in 1989 to 1991 and said, we need to be very, very careful about the pace of reforms, about dealing with the political consequences, and understanding the sources of instability that can arise from tampering too quickly. So if anything, I would think the Russians are now returning the favor and saying, we acted too hastily, and the Chinese model was maybe able to perpetuate itself because it learned from the mistakes of the end of the Cold War. If we want to stay in power, and if we don't want to concede to opposition challengers, let's look at the Chinese attempts at social control, at informational kind of gathering and monitoring, the way that kind of national champions have been built up, relations with near abroad and investments as ways of solidifying our place in the regional economy and coming under less pressure from the United States and other international actors, sort of regaining quote unquote great power status. I think the Russians have looked to the Chinese model more so in the last 10 years. So I think I would flip it in some sense, that there was like the Chinese learned from the Russians in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and now it seems like we're seeing the opposite type of effect. And it always comes down to how much you incorporate the lessons about how effective they may be.
So I'm just going to take the chair's prerogative
Sure.
and jump in on that. So it seems to me, just as there was in the 80s, a huge difference between Russia and China, and that is institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, this is obviously a a Chinese specialist would say, oh, China's the party's weak, blah, blah, blah. And Xi as an individual is ascendant. But relatively speaking, I mean, Russia doesn't have these kinds of institutions, right? And Gorbachev was not starting with the same thing at all that Deng had in that sense. And a lot of perestroika was about trying to get control over the party and then and consolidate his own position. So it seems to me that this will be another failure for that reason, right? Is that too much of politics is sistema and who you know, and that determines whether or not your business will be protected or who will take it. That is not China, right? So they have a form of rule of law. Russia has less predictability in its corruption. And so this is tremendously problematic, it seems to me, and wildly different from China. Whether or not they understand that and can do anything about it is a huge question. I wanted to ask you about that. And then also, you used the word schizophrenic earlier in describing different aspects of the Russian economy. And I would say, since the issue of public opinion came up in young people, this is also schizophrenic, right? So, your dissertation supervisor, Tim Fry, wrote a great paper with other people pointing out how Putin's popularity is actually probably real. Mm-hmm. Yet, there are other people saying they're young members of the younger generation who are at least expressing these preferences on paper, believing, and then there is some kind of brain drain. It's very hard to measure. So that's happening, yet Putin support's really high, and it's real. So the question is, the other thing too is that although small and medium-sized businesses are not, that's not the core of the Russian economy yet, and that should be over time. So maybe it's just too early. They are improving on ease of doing business, partly because of what you pointed out, that the government is actually quite effective administratively. We often underestimate that, I think, and think of it as only great in terms of repressing, but actually it's pretty good in terms of implementing certain kinds of policies, at least. But the problem again is that it's not predictable, right? And the corruption is not predictable, and Russia's a huge country. So the question is, what happens in 2024, right?
It's all building to that.
Yeah, so I'm building to that, right? So you have, the really interesting thing that's happening by then too is that you have young people, many of whom in Moscow, at least, and in smaller numbers in other parts of the country, have come out on the streets and are pointing to grand corruption. So petty corruption, I think they've gotten, to some degree, they've gotten that under control. There's still huge problems. Grand corruption, though, seems to be a big problem, and people seem to be noticing it much more, and younger people frustrated much more by it. So is this, the fact that there aren't these institutions, the fact that there isn't predictability in what will happen in 2024, we don't know whether there will for sure be an election. We don't know who will run. We don't know that Putin won't. And then you have this kind of new generation that wants different things, that wants predictability, that wants more open access, at least in Moscow, right? Yes. So how do they overcome this big challenge, or how do you think that people in power will grapple with this big challenge of what's coming in the ensuing years? It's a much more sophisticated society than it was in 2000.
Absolutely. And I think those are three really great questions. I think one thread that goes through all of them, the China one, the popularity, and then 2024 is just how different Russia is China because it has elections. How much elections change the whole way that government works. I think one thing we don't appreciate as much is that Russian citizens demand elections, and we do surveys just about every year, about 80 to 90% of Russians believe that they're living in a democracy. And when you tell them that there's a lot of electoral fraud, they drop their support for the Putin government because that you pierce that bubble. So, and their normative stance is that Russia is and should be a democracy. And they're not getting sufficient information necessarily to learn that there's a lot of weaknesses and failings on that account. So when you have elections, it changes the way that you build institutions. You're less likely to have nice rotational promotion-based incentives like the Chinese do, or some of the best and most productive are rising to higher positions, and then they're kind of contractually obliged to step down after certain years. In Russia, it's about how do we maintain electoral support across the entire country and make sure that wherever we are, we are aligned with the most loyal and the most popular group there to make sure we're not giving power away to the opposition. And that changes and makes things less predictable, I think.
It looks right, at least.
Exactly, so that people believe.
Power, right.
That's going to create all of these problems in terms of kind of how you apply the law, who wins and who loses if you're under this electoral mindset and electoral pressure a lot of the time. And if you can't just get away with elections, you have to kind of accommodate those demands, and it's going to make the system potentially more flexible, and in that create a lot more uncertainty. And I think that's really important in terms of explaining the differences between the two countries. The next point, or the next 2 points, are about Putin's popularity. Is it real? I think there is I think there's more growing polarization in Russia, and I don't think we're at the level of the 1990s where there are articulated groups about where the country should go. I think one group is still firmly in the minority. But although I completely agree with a lot of the kind of surveys that show that 70 to 80% of popularity is real, we just don't have an alternative yet that could actually be presented at the other side of that question. I think those surveys are really open about that. Like when you just ask, do you like Putin, people are quite honest in saying, yeah. But when you say, was it Putin or this other person that has governing experience, that doesn't have a criminal past, that maybe is not as connected to corruption, we just have never been in that situation where people have given a second choice. So we just don't know how they would react. And the government has been very conscious of the idea that if you prevent the emergence of another alternative, you're able to prolong the system more than anybody expected. So much effort has just been removing the idea that anybody else could govern Russia besides Putin, and that's been a quite effective way of holding on to power. So that gets into 2024. How do you prevent another emergence? And I think right now it's less about whether or not Putin stays on, but whether or not the party and the rest of the other people continue to govern as badly or are given the same type of power. So if I were them and I wanted to stay past 2024, I mean, the only way you really can put yourself in the Kremlin shoes is to assume a very rational actor type of situation and say, how would they maximize their chances of staying on? If I were them, I would renew the party cadres and either get rid of a lot of the things in the United Russia and a lot of the ways that the bureaucracy works now, put as many fresh faces that have proven their loyalty at lower levels, and start trying to show the public that the system, as rotten as it was, can be reformed by gradual change and replacement with other people that are new. And that these people have a more technocratic bent. They've gone through these elaborate competitions that I've talked about. They've gone to Western business schools. The country is keeping up with world trends. And those bad actors in the 90s and 2000s, we're going to try to maybe expropriate some of their assets, where maybe we'll increase some of the taxation. They're going to slowly recede from the sidelines, and there's going to be this renewal. I think that's probably their only option, is Putin staying in power, but a different set of next level people underneath him to try to signal to the public that you're getting the stability of the guy at the top, but you're getting different policy makers. And that's a really tough thing to do because it's hard to trust people with that type of power. But if I were them, that's what I would do. I'm sorry to give. I mean, this is videotaped. I doubt they're watching, but just in case, that's the kind of a renewal that I think is the only thing that would resonate with the Russian population. And I think because the government is so rational, we would probably want to expect that type of strategy. They're not haphazardly, they're thinking through a lot of these issues. So they're not as unpredictable as we might think, that just one person making kind of arbitrary decisions.
All right, one last question. Steve.
Steve Piper from CSAC. If you look at Russian economic performance over the last 6 to 7 years, it's not been impressive, and most projections seem to think it's going to be a pretty anemic growth in the future, 1 to 1.5%, which contrasts very badly with Putin's first two terms from 2000 to 2008. Do you see the Kremlin making any changes? And if so, what tweaks should they make to this model to deliver better performance? Because at some point, presumably, people really do get disaffected with an economy that doesn't seem to be delivering.
Yes. I mean, the watchword is quote unquote structural reform, and any single op-ed you read is Russia needs more structural reform, but very rarely do people go into details about what that actually would mean. So let me take a stab at what they could do to stimulate growth without sacrificing kind of political stability. And I'm kind of surprised sometimes that they don't opt for this. One, I think, is privatization. A lot of these big firms selling off bigger stakes to international investors. The Russian stock market is doing really well. It's the best performing in the world over the last year, and the currency has done really well. People are looking for higher rates of return, and I think there's a lot of Western investors that would be more open to putting their money in some of these companies if the government would allow minority shares. And there's a lot of kind of concerns about property rights protection. But even giving some international investors a seat at the table of some of these big companies could improve their efficiency, increase the return on assets, and improve growth. So it's inviting some of that kind of investor-led corporate governance, which is something you can manage. You can put better restrictions on there. And I'm frankly surprised that they've been so close to the idea of international capital flows. In terms of the bureaucracy, what seems to be happening right now is you've got the right ideas floating around in many of the different agencies, especially coming from Kudrin, but this reticence at the very top that this is all but self-serving behavior for him to take power. The idea that in order to have, that you need to give power to reformers in order to get new ideas into government, whereas I think you could, like they've done before, selectively choose some of the major things that Kudrin is advocating, such as reducing spending on the military, redirecting a lot of that towards education and healthcare, and not just through the national projects, but like a more decentralized spending at the local and regional governments where they get to decide what they spend the money on, and it's not just coming from the top. One strategic move that the Putin government has done since 2005 is to push a lot of the spending decisions up to the ministry level, and they just tell the localities what to do. And that is counterproductive in so many senses. So by what Kudrin's advocating is, I don't want to decide every single spending decision. I don't think the ministry should. You should give more power to the mayors and to the councils and to the governors, give them more money and say, here's a couple of accountability type of measures that we're going to hold you to, but you're going to have more autonomy to decide where these vast resources that are coming from are going to come from. So I would say decentralization and privatization are two things that wouldn't rock the boat to the point where the regime would collapse, but could get you an extra 0.5% or 1% on economic growth without sacrificing stability. And that's the tip of the iceberg. I can name 10 more, but from their point of view, you've got to do the most palatable things that are not going to be too upsetting. And I would love to be in some of these rooms when they discuss them and why the consensus doesn't push in that way, because they seem kind of mild to me with these big upsides, and that's a puzzle.
I think it has to do with preserving rents.
Yeah.
And
fear of the foreign, I think, is a lot of it.
For sure. And losing control. And we can talk later about decentralization, but I once wrote on that. All right, well, we've already come to 1:15, and our new regimen is stopping at 1:15 instead of 1:30. Thank you, David, very much. That was really informative, really interesting, and thanks, everyone, for great questions.
Thank you all.